Here we go, folks, for the second half of lesson 14. This is lesson 14b, and specifically we're talking about World War II from 1941 to 1945 and America's role in it. If you recall from last time, what we really were looking at is the lead up to World War II. What were the events that led to this huge conflict? And now we're going to talk about the war has started in Europe. America has just entered the war because of the bombing in Pearl Harbor by Japan. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how the war works itself out. So the reading for this particular section is going to be chapter 26, pages 824 to 836. So that's the rest of that chapter dealing with World War II. Some terms you're going to run across are genocide, collaborator, mobilization, kamikaze, and Cold War. So take a look for those words and expect to see those on your assessment. One of the events that's defined and connected with World War II is the Holocaust. And probably most of you understand what the Holocaust is. Essentially, it was the forced mass killing, the genocide of over 6 million Jewish and other minorities by the Nazi Empire during the World War II time frame, right before and during World War II. One of the largest single genocides ever in the world's history, and it still is felt and dealt with today around the world. So the ideology of the Nazi Party and the reason that Hitler became so popular was that he could rally the German people who had been beat so badly in World War I back to feel good about being Germans, back to that nationalist sentiment. It's good to be German, we have these things in common. And the way he did that was by comparing him, or the German people, to the groups that he felt were not German. And this is really the classic setting an us versus them situation. So anybody that was not an Aryan or Jewish, or excuse me, not Jewish, but German, historically and culturally, was considered to be kind of a persecuted group. And it was their fault that Germany had so many problems before. So some of those groups were the Jews, the Slavs, disabled individuals, gypsies, and homosexuals. And those were the people that were focused on by the Nazis during this Holocaust. There were laws specifically that were written called the Nuremberg Laws, which defined what was a German and what was a non-German, and what the rules were for each of those two things. Many of the Jewish people saw the writing on the wall, they saw what was coming at them, and so they fled. And we had a large number of Jewish refugees leaving Germany and Central Europe, trying to get away from the Nazis. A little bit more about the Holocaust. There was a conference that was held in a German city called Wannsee in 1942, where the Nazis figured out what they wanted to do with the Jewish and other persecuted groups. And they essentially decided they wanted to come up with what's called the final solution, the idea of we're going to neutralize and kill as many of these individuals as we can to get them out of our borders. They did this through a number of different ways. The classic way that we think about is the concentration camp, these huge fenced-in enclosures where Jewish people and other non-desirable elements of the Nazi regime were placed, often worked extremely hard, and often herded into terrible areas and died of disease. We also had, and sometimes in connection with the concentration camps, the extermination camps. And those were camps that were specifically designed to herd people in and kill them as quickly as possible, generally by using some sort of a gas or by machine gun or a number of different ways that was accomplished. We also, the Nazi Party put together the mobile extermination units, where groups of German army personnel would go into cities where there were large Jewish populations, round those folks up, and exterminate them. So it was very clinical, it was done very well, and it led to, as you can see, over 6 million people dying. Now, the Jewish individuals and other groups did not just sit passively by and watch this happen. There were uprisings, and there were uprisings in a number of cities and a number of camps. But the power was strongly with the Nazi Party, and there was nothing much that the Jewish people could do other than trying to flee or hope that the Allies would eventually rescue them. The United States had to mobilize for war, and this is a country that's been neutral. We have to convert very quickly into a wartime economy once we're bombed by Japan. And the huge thing that really led to victory in World War II, as it did in World War I, is the fact that America is isolated from Europe. It's not being bombed, and its infrastructure and cities aren't being destroyed, and has this incredible industrial capacity. So we can build stuff. We can produce stuff very, very fast. Arms, ships, and the United States kind of pulled together. If any of you remember what it was like in this country about during 9/11, was that kind of feel, just more so in the 1940s. So what happened when the Germans, we saw, started off incredibly strong, as did the Japanese in the Pacific? What happened to kind of turn the tide? Well, certainly the United States coming in was one thing. Another thing is that we could bomb strategic areas of Germany to make sure that they couldn't produce the same amount of weapons and material that we, the Allies, especially the United States, could. United States troops were trained in England. They were trained specifically for one particular invasion that we'll talk about in a second. And then they also battled their way through Africa and into Italy in the early 1940s, 1942, 1943. In 1944, the biggest invasion of the war happened. It was called D-Day. If you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, that shows what that battle might have looked like at the very beginning. And it involved over 7,000 ships, 23,000 paratroopers, essentially people that are, coming in from the sky, over 100,000 soldiers, and it all happened on the Normandy beaches of France. As soon as the Allies, the Americans, the British, and the French and the Canadians were able to get a foothold on the beaches, they began driving inland. And that was really the end of Germany. It was kind of a slow retreat from that point. On the other side of the world, in the Pacific Ocean, the United States was fighting the other part of its war against Japan. This was called the Second Front. The vast majority of energy and material was put into the First Front, which was Europe, but the United States also had to try to battle back the Japanese. And really it became kind of an Army versus Navy. There was an army working, kind of doing something called island hopping, where they were jumping from small island to small island, as you can see on this map. And the Navy, of course, was trying to take care of things with big sea battles. Eventually, one of the major things that happens is the Philippines are retaken, the islands of the Philippines, and that's critical because it allows air raids on Japan. So now we can take off bombers from the Philippines and drop bombs onto Japan to try to beat them back. The Japanese, as they start to lose, turn to a new weapon, and that's called the kamikaze pilot. That's the idea of someone actually getting into a plane and using that plane as a bomb, a flying bomb essentially, and ramming it generally into ships, into the United States ships, to try to win the war that way. Obviously, a lot of loss of life that way. So as Germany is pushing back, we also see the Russians are pushing in from the east too. So now the Germans are being kind of caught in the middle between the Americans and the British on one side and the Russians on the other. We have a couple of final battles. One's called the Battle of the Bulge, that the Germans try to push out and have one last surge, but the Americans are just far too superior, and eventually the Soviets take over the capital, Berlin. Hitler commits suicide as this is happening, and the Allies meet on the Elbe River in Germany, and that leads to VE, or Victory in Europe Day, in May of 1945. A little bit later in the summer, the war ends in the Pacific, and there's several last little battles that are incredibly costly. One is called the Battle of Iwo Jima. If you've ever seen Letters of Our Fathers, Flags of Our Fathers, I think it's called, and Letters from Iwo Jima, those are a couple of movies that recently came out that talk a little bit about this battle. And then we also see the firebombing of Japan. Okay, over 80,000 Japanese civilians are killed when the United States firebombs the Japanese cities. We have one final battle called the Battle of Okinawa, and then the Americans come up with an incredible piece of technology called the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb is dropped twice, once on the Japanese city of Hiroshima and once on the Japanese city of Nagasaki, killing and wiping out essentially the cities. The Japanese at that point understand that they can no longer wage war against the United States, and they surrender on August 15th of 1945. So that ends the world, but it has completely shattered the world. The power structure that was there has ended. The terms of surrender are such that the United States really needs to try to rebuild parts of Europe that it's taken over, and Japan as well. Germany is also divided up by the two major powers, the Western powers with the United States and Britain and France, and the Eastern power of the Soviet Union, and that's going to lead on to something called the Cold War. So we have, in order to prevent, just like we did after World War I, to prevent this from happening again, we have something called the creation of the United Nations. The United Nations is the organization of all the nations of the world to try to avoid these things. But we'll see that now, after World War II, we really have two superpowers. We have the United States on one side and the Soviet Union on the other side. That's going to set the tone for the next unit called the Cold War. And we'll talk about that next time.